Imagine you're at a grocery store shopping for dish soap. There's the classic brand you grew up using, but it comes with a ton of plastic packaging and it's got a bunch of crazy looking chemicals in it. Then there's the eco friendly option that promises it's 98% biodegradable, or the all natural option made of plant based cleaning compounds. One brand even has a fluffy little duckling on the bottle promising it can be used to save birds from oil spills. Maybe you've learned to reject such claims as simply corporate greenwashing, a surface level attempt to market a product as eco friendly when really it's anything but. Or maybe you respond reflexively, well, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. Still, we can buy these green eco friendly products hoping they're slightly better for the environment than the alternative. This is mostly an option for wealthier people, as these products tend to be more expensive, have a higher upfront cost, or require visiting a specialty store. Or we can restrain ourselves by consuming less, buying fewer products, looking for options with less packaging, driving our cars as little as possible, and turning off the lights when we leave a room. Like a monk retreating from earthly pleasures, or like a knight in shining armor gallantly restraining his desire for his lady. Lady Nature, in this case, so that she can remain pure. Either way, under capitalism, caring about the environment is reduced to a consumer demographic. Whether you only buy eco-friendly biodegradable dish soap, or you get your dish soap refills in a concentrated form from a zero-waste store, you're still part of a niche group of consumers that brands want to market to. Green capitalism is still capitalism, and usually not all that green in the final analysis. I don't mean to suggest that conservation doesn't matter or that we shouldn't make greener choices when we can, but sometimes the greener option is just greenwashing, and our individual choices as consumers aren't enough. We can't stop the destruction of our biosphere by making smarter choices as consumers. Something much deeper than our shopping habits needs to shift. We need to change our very understanding of nature, or more specifically, our relationship with nature. We need to see it not as something to exploit or to restrain ourselves from exploiting, but rather as a continuation of ourselves. A grocery store, a shopper, a bottle of dish soap, the parking lot outside, the mountains off in the distance. In a sense, these are not separate entities, but continuations of one another. They share an ecological relationship. So what do we desire in that moment at the grocery store? In one sense, we desire a dish soap that won't hurt the environment as much, or we want to avoid buying a bottle that we'll only use once and then throw away. But on a deeper level, we desire a world where our choices don't feel like choosing the lesser of environmental evils, where we can enjoy a meal without destroying a river or a rainforest in the process. If our consumption habits are damaging the environment, we're really damaging ourselves. We're threatening the natural forces in the world that gave rise to us in the first place, that enrich our lives and provide us with a bounty of resources to enjoy. But the solution isn't to restrain ourselves either. We need to channel our desires for convenience, for pleasure, for the bounty of nature in ways that aren't destructive. Social ecology is a school of thought that started with the work of Murray Bookchin, drawing from existing theories like feminism, Marxism, and the environmental movement. According to the website for the Institute of Social Ecology, social ecology advocates a reconstructive and transformative outlook on social and environmental issues, and promotes a directly democratic confederal politics. Social ecology envisions a moral economy that moves beyond scarcity and hierarchy towards a world that reharmonizes human communities with the natural world while celebrating diversity, creativity, and freedom. This can sound a bit wishy-washy without getting a thorough grounding in the philosophy behind it. So, here to explain these theoretical foundations, as well as her own work developing a politics of social ecological desire, is Chaia Heller from the Institute for Social Ecology.
So my name is Chaia Heller. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm, I guess, many different things because I'm older. Um, I have a background in philosophy, political philosophy, and I became an anthropologist in my early mid 30s. I'm a feminist and I love anything feminist queer theory. I'm a writer. I've been a teacher and professor, teaching on the graduate level, and I'm an artist. I paint, and my world is kind of filled with all of those different things that I do. I'm kind of almost always doing all of those things.
I feel that. Yeah, I'm starting on my journey of trying to do all of the things all of the time. So you've worked with a lot of different theories and theoretical backgrounds, and now you're working with the Institute of Social Ecology, among other projects. But why were you drawn to social ecology?
Well, that's a really long story because I started at the ISC, the Institute for Social Ecology, in 1984.
Oh, wow.
Very Orwellian years. So literally most of my life I've spent being working through and around in the Institute for Social Ecology. I kind of washed up on the shore of the ISC when the summer I was turning like 22. And I've been a philosophy, or I was finishing a philosophy major in college. And I was an activist in college. And during those days, the really central issue was fighting apartheid in South Africa, the divestment movement. I was really active in that. And I remember feeling very frustrated that my none of my philosophy professors at Grinnell, I went to a college in Iowa called Grinnell, that none of my philosophy professors would ever kind of say what they thought about any of the theories that we were talking about, or they would never talk about what was happening in the world. And I ended up at the ISC kind of on a little bit of a whim. I didn't quite know what to do with my summer, and a friend of mine was not going to be doing a work study job at the ISC, working in the kitchen. But I took her job and didn't really know hardly anything about social ecology. And I basically spent my days whipping up bats of granola and tofu. And I spent my evenings studying with Murray Bookchin. And he was this, I thought he was very old. He was in all of 62. And he was a living, breathing philosopher who was completely engaged and immersed in the political world. And the political world drove him to commit his life to philosophy. And he believed that philosophy should be in service to making humanity's life better and also to mend humanity's relationship with the rest of the natural world. And I couldn't believe that, my luck in accidentally finding this teacher who really became a lifelong, at least for the rest of his life, friend and mentor. He wasn't just like my teacher, but we really did have a really wonderful friendship for 22 years. And he invited me to move to Burlington, Vermont, which I did in 1985. And I lived there for 6 years doing study groups with Murray. And I was part of a group called the Burlington Greens. So we were doing, some nights we'd meet to do studying, and some nights we would meet as a political organization. And then I started teaching at the Institute for Social Ecology in 1985, started teaching the feminism and ecology class. And I basically never left. So it's like, I can't imagine my life without the Institute for Social Ecology and all of the amazing people I met along the way. I can't imagine what my life would be like otherwise, because it's been so central. But it's definitely led to a very interesting, very multi-textured life.
Wow, I had no idea you'd been teaching there that long. I took your class in 2021, I think.
Yeah.
So in that class, we read a chapter of your book, The Ecology of Everyday Life, and that's kind of what I wanted to focus on today because I think it takes a lot of really important insights from social ecology, but also expands in some really interesting ways. I mean, yours is a very important politically engaged philosophy, and I've been really inspired by it. So I want to introduce it by talking about sort of the conceptions of nature or the desire for nature that you're trying to break away from. And the two biggest ones, at least in my reading, would be the romantic view of nature and the consumerist view or desire for nature. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about those, why they're problematic, why we need to break away from them in developing a more ethical relationship with nature.
Yeah, so what's really interesting about writing a book is that you're writing always in a very specific, like, temporal container. And so the book came out in 99. And if it takes 3 years to get a book together, it really means I was done writing it in 96 or so. Mm. And so say the book was looking at 10 years of my thinking, it really was the culmination of my thinking and some streams of my thinking from, say, 84 to 96, 97. And during that time, we were in what I call a period of ecological thinking that I would call sort of the Germanic romantic period of ecology. And in the late 90s, that really shifted, and we started what I call a decolonial moment of ecology. So in previous to the late 90s, mid-late 90s, when the anti-globalization move sort of emerged, the ecology discussion was very kind of, even when people were trying to be political, it was very depoliticized and very apolitical. And people were very much looking at ecological activism as an individual kind of mission to shop your way to ecotopia, buying the most pure, organic products that were most sustainably produced. So consumer ecology was very big. I watched Earth Day get completely co-opted by corporations, start greenwashing themselves and painting themselves as ecological, ecologically oriented. And basically, the ecological project was kind of framed in very reformist terms and very individual terms. Like, if you could just lead an ecologically exemplary life by using the least amount of energy and reducing your carbon footprint and buying the right products, that if we all just did this, we would somehow create an ecological society. And I call that romantic ecology because it's based on this idea of nature as an other who's female, that this ecumenical we of humanity, have sullied and we've destroyed her purity. And what we need to do is repent for our sins and try to bow down to Mother Nature or Lady Nature and, change our terrible ways as human beings. And if we can do that, all individuals, sign on to that mission, we'll create a new society. And the reason I wrote this book was to kind of speak back to this particular cultural moment that this still exists today. But it's, at least there's a little more politicization going on than there was in the 80s and 90s. But there really was this kind of, I felt, need to underline what are the real causes of the ecological crisis. They're not just individuals who are consuming. It's the military-industrial complex. It's the carbon-based capitalist economy. It's an extraction society, but it's also 500 years of colonialism. It's the colonial project. It's cis heteropatriarchy that uses women to do 80% of agricultural labor on the planet, in addition to producing most of the food, the medicine on the planet, and do most of the kind of reproductive labor that Marx and Engels wrote about. And so I thought that talking about ecology, going beyond romantic ecology, was really a way to invite people to consider ecology as a social and revolutionary project, where we have to not just change ourselves, we have to change the capitalist system and replace it with a directly democratic, municipalized or moral economy. And we have to replace the state as a tyrannical formation with a confederation of directly democratic, self-governing cities, towns, and villages. And that philosophy is called communalism. And at this point in history, what's amazing is a lot of the tendencies of the ecology movement that were so frustrating in the 80s and 90s are not as forefronted at this point, because there's a lot of people who totally get that ecology has to be social. It's amazing to try to think back to the 80s and 90s, where I had to literally explain to people why ecology was a social issue, where I think now even the most basic understanding of ecology, people kind of get the climate change, which is euphemism for climate crisis and disaster, that there is something driving climate that has something to do with, a petroleum-based society and carbon emissions. People kind of get, at least the left, I would say, basically gets that there's something awry, something amiss with society that's creating these ecological problems. And if I was to write this book today, I would write it very differently. And I wrote this decades ago. And yet there's still, it's still true that we still do have a romantic ecology, and people do still bring a very individualistic approach to thinking about ecology. But at least today, I feel like there's more of a decolonial ecology where people really understand the planet as having gone through a colonial phase that ravaged peoples and natures and paved the way for the crisis that we're living in right now.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up that you did write this book several decades ago. It's framed in that era, those issues. So I mean, I am curious, if you wrote the book today, what sort of social trends or political trends you would want to focus on more, if you feel like in general we are becoming more aware of the social aspect of ecology, or if maybe there are new things that worry you.
I think what's funny is that, the goal then for me, like the bar was so low, was at least to get people to think beyond themselves as individuals and see themselves as part of a social project, and that understand ecological problems having a social origin. And now the bar is a little higher, because I think there's enough kind of fluency in the concept of like that there could be a more direct form of democracy than what we're living right now, and practicing, at least in the US with a Republican democracy. A lot of people are really inspired what's happening in Rojava with the Kurdish freedom movement, where you have, since 2009, people carrying out an incredible experiment or praxis. It's not even just experiment, in living a democratic. Their leader calls it democratic confederalism. Bookchin, who kind of developed this idea, called it communalism. So I would say I am writing a book now, and it's called The Politics and Philosophy of Social Ecology, and it's going to contain a lot of the things in the ecology of everyday life. But I would say the challenge now is not just to get people to see that the ecological is social, but the ecological has to be political, and really focus on the need for people to believe not only the possibility, but the necessity of creating directly democratic societies where people can actually inform the policies that shape our social and ecological lives.
Great. I'm really looking forward to that book. So there's a quote from the book that stuck with me when you're talking about the romantic view of nature, that romantic love represents an attempt to love and know another from behind a wall of domination. You use this analogy of like a knight and like a lady, and the way that the knight supposedly loves the lady is he restrains his desire for her. He doesn't violate her purity. He like holds back. He's gentlemanly. And I love that you're just like, well, if he really loved her, he'd want to set her free. He'd want her to be his equal. This constraint of desire is not a healthy, productive way to desire things. It's not the way we should be desiring each other. It's not the way we should be desiring nature or ecology. So that leads me into your idea of the socio-erotic. And what really strikes me about the socio-erotic is that it's not a needs-based theory, as you put it. It's, we need to look beyond just meeting the basic needs of people in the new society. We need to cultivate desire, let desire flourish. So why is that so important?
So the dialectic between need and desire is an old one. If you look at the history of nature philosophy, there's this kind of polarity between nature as the realm of necessity and need and natural law and deterministic, knowable scientific laws of nature versus nature as the realm of potential freedom. And Bookchin he wrote a really cool essay called Freedom and Necessity in Nature. And that's in a very thin volume, very thin sort of book that Bookchin wrote that's my favorite, and it's called The Philosophy of Social Ecology. And in that essay, he really maps out how sort of remaining within the tradition, the philosophical tradition that sees nature as this realm of necessity, where we are, again, rule bound and nature is stingy, and we're always going to be dealing with scarcity, and we have to, always try to triumph and gain our freedom by dominating nature. And that is kind of like the formula that's still out there. It was certainly Marx's understanding of the relationship between humanity and nature was nature is the realm of necessity, and humanity finds its freedom by slowly making its technology more and more sophisticated to the point where we can minimize scarcity, provide for everybody's needs, and that then we create a dictatorship of the proletariat where the workers are all together providing for everyone's needs. And that's the good society. And eventually the state would wither away. We have pure socialism. And that is kind of like the Marxian vision. And what's really missing is any understanding of the revolution as leading to more than fulfilling just needs, more than ridding ourselves of scarcity, more than just having a workers' run state where we live to work, basically. We're working animals, we're toiling animals. So when Bookchin, who was raised as a Marxist, started to look at that freedom and necessity formulation, he thought, I think a really key thing here is to start to rethink nature as the realm of potential freedom, where human beings can actually, through a conscious process of figuring out how to create a free and directly democratic society that's free of hierarchy, can actually create something better than just satisfying everybody's needs. We can actually create what Bookchin called a post-scarcity society. And he wrote this in the 60s. He wrote a really wonderful essay called Post-Scarcity Anarchism. This is a new concept, and it's a really great essay. It's one of my favorites. It's in his book of essays called Post-Scarcity Anarchism, which I highly recommend. And, in a post-scarcity world, we would be working very minimal hours, like 3 to 4 hours, more like the way hunter-gatherers worked for hundreds of thousands of years. And we'd have all this available time to be creative, to engage in education, to act as citizens, to become Zune politikon, become political animals, and to create a desirable world that is qualitatively meaningful and rich, and where we have time to build meaningful relationships with each other and with the rest of the natural world. It's not just a grim fairy tale where we're all, we're creating sustainability. We're barely hanging on, but we all have enough bread. It's way, we actually are able to use technology, ecological technologies, in such a way that we really do not see ourselves primarily as workers, but as citizens, people who live in a community and are empowered to make decisions about their community. So we're moving from a worker based identity, a worker centered identity, to more like a civic identity where we're people creating desirable worlds. And so making that shift from nature's realm of necessity to nature's a potential realm of freedom is a profound one, because the whole political project changes, and our we don't free ourselves by dominating nature and getting rid of scarcity. We actually free ourselves by working with the rest of the natural world and with each other to create the freest and most aesthetically and sensually and qualitatively beautiful society that we can create.
So, working only like 3 to 4 hours a day and, like getting to enjoy the natural environment around me, getting to set the trajectory of my own life. That sounds fantastic. But there's more to it than that, because it's not just my individual desire that's at stake here. You talk about a social desire, and even that desire is at its base inherently social. Could you talk about that?
Sure. So moving from a necessitarian view of nature a more freedom-based view of nature, or nature is a realm of potential freedom, also requires shifting from seeing ourselves as kind of passive individual players who are just, or consumers who are just observing and voting once a year and buying things as individuals, shifting that to really seeing ourselves as part of a community that is an eco community that includes the rest of the natural world, and a community of other people that we are accountable to and that we feel responsible for. So it's really asking us to move beyond our kind of ego, self-oriented views that capitalism, particularly in the consumer capitalism in late modern capitalism, really teaches us that we find our freedom and our expression in the way that we buy stuff and dress ourselves. But here we find our sociality really in how we, again, govern together in such a way that allows us to have, all of us to have the highest level of freedom. But it's really about breaking out of a really intense individualism. That's kind of like individuality is a good thing, but a harsh individualism where we're all seeing ourselves as kind of having inherently conflicting interests, we're all competing for scarce resources. That's the kind of individualism we don't want. That's not going to bring us to a good society. But having a healthy kind of individuality in the context of understanding ourselves as part of a greater sociality or social whole, that is a really nice tension: individuality, communality.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up that tension. So you have sort of a framework called the 5 fingers of the socio-erotic. Does that still feel like a relevant framework to you? Just wanted to ask that off the bat here.
I have to laugh a little. It's funny coming up with ideas and sort of heuristics or framing devices, and like I literally find it funny now, in a way, but not that it's like not meaningful. It's just funny. I can't believe I did that. It's like, wow, that's really funny. So I came up with the idea of the 5 fingers of social desire when I was teaching.
Hmm.
And this is one of the wonderful examples of how, and it sounds so cheesy, but it's so true. The greatest lesson, or the greatest way to learn, is by teaching. And everything I know, I can literally say this, everything that I know and everything I'm able to be articulate about, I learn from my students' questions and my students' arguments and my students' critiques and their hearing from their experiences. So my students' questions and the way I would try to teach ideas would allow me to see, let me try to explain it this way. Okay, let me try to explain it this way. And over the years, and I was, taught at the first these long summer programs for 22 summers in a row, and I'm still teaching social ecology. I would come up with various kind of metaphors or framing devices, and this one kind of stuck, and I do still like it, although I find it's kind of funny. And but I wanted to say, okay, so if I was going to kind of look at the features of sociality, and what would the different dimensions of social desire look like, I wanted to sort of create a dialectical process where one idea or one category would kind of give rise to the next. And so I started the first, I used my hand. So the first finger of the hand of social desire is the pinky. And it's the smallest. And I thought about when people are first born, one of our first instincts is to, to nurse, and to use our mouth to get nutrition. And, when I had a baby, I was blown away by watching this creature come out of my body who was a wholly sensual organism. And they were just, my child who's a trans guy, so she was a baby girl, I thought, was just very, her whole orientation around being was sensual. Just, I want a nurse, I want to sleep, I want comfort, I want you to hold me. And then I sort of looked at developmentally how out of this I started seeing the emergence of another person, another subjectivity in my then daughter. And I really saw how profound the associative or the social impulse is, that if she was nothing else, she was social. She wanted to connect with me, feel connected to me, feel connected to her father, feel connected to other people in our family and in her little life world. And I watched her have this real need to associate. As she became a social being, even as an infant, it was just amazing to watch. And then I watched her as a toddler really start to differentiate herself. And I love the middle finger, as kind of, differentiate this, like this idea of defiance and determining oneself as being different from others. And watching my child really become somebody, a formidable, separate individual who had their own tastes, inclinations, preferences, priorities. And it was wild to watch. And so instead of wanting to be more kind of with mama, wanting to be really more out there and defining themselves and being a social being out in the world, but being seen for themselves. And that to me was a really important moment of watching them want to feel more recognition as a being unto themselves. And so that would be the middle finger of the finger of differentiation. And so I call this sensual desire. I should say the pinky social desire, the ring finger, because I just picked it because he will put a ring on it. It's how we show that we're connected to someone. And then that was the associative figure of desire. And then the differentiated figure, social desire. And then I thought of the pointer as being the part of the self that I was watching emerge in my child. I'm really fascinated by early child psychology. I have a master's in psychology and I worked as a therapist for about 10 years. So it's something I have a background in and I feel really excited about. And I was watched that not only did my child want to associate and feel like part of a whole bigger than themselves, not only did they want to be differentiated, be seen as an individual, they also wanted to be developing. And it's wild to watch a child develop. Nobody's saying, hey, keep developing. Nobody's saying it's time to, you've been crawling a while, so now you should start walking. They just do it. And if you have a developmental delay or you have developmental disability, you do it a different way. But there is something about development that just happens. It's this unfolding and it's this desire. And I watched, my kid and other people's kids want to hold a crayon and move it around and make colors and want to learn this and that. And they wanted to become. And so I call that developmental desire. And then the last figure would be the opposable thumb. And I really loved the thumb as a symbol of when you put the thumb with the other fingers, you get a fist. And to me, that is the symbol of opposition. And so I call that oppositional desire. Because to me, once we, develop these various parts of ourselves that are essential, associative, that we're differentiated beings, we're developing, we also want to create a world that is good and just. It's not just I want to join the world, but I want to join a world where I can weigh in about how things should be and what is good and what is bad and what is right and what is wrong, what's ethical versus unethical, just versus unjust. And so to me, the protest fist, which is pretty universal, I would say at this point, is a really important part of social desire. It's to not accept the status quo. It's to always say, we can do better, we will do better. And that as we uncover, if we have the opportunity, if we can uncover ever greater levels of freedom, as we move towards the horizon of freedom, it recedes from us as we up the bar for what counts as freedom, as we continue to evolve and grow our idea of freedom. And so opposition is always important, even in a good society, even in a directly democratic society that's feminist and LGBTQIA positive, even in the best society, there always has to be a dissenting minority that helps push the dialectic of freedom further and ups the bar for what counts for freedom. And so the hand was kind of, and the fingers were this teaching device that I just really liked. And a lot of people have found it meaningful, some people not so much. I think everybody agrees it's kind of funny, particularly the middle finger.
I found it really memorable when I was writing the questions. I was like, I gotta ask about the 5 fingers. I remember the 5 fingers. What I also like about a hand is it's like the whole hand is agency. It's not just passive. And I see how these 5 aspects, they're not just within a single individual, but you can see them in a society as a whole. We need individuality, but also association and development. These things all build upon each other to make a good society and to make a society that allows those greater degrees of freedom.
Yeah, it's kind of like that concept of that there's no, individual principle that is good unto itself. If you take any of those qualities, any of those kinds of social desire, and you take them but just unto themselves, they're not good necessarily at all. If we had a society where we're just into our sensual, filling our own sensual needs, that wouldn't be so great. If we had a society where we're just all out for ourselves with a differentiative desire, that wouldn't be so great. It's kind of what we're living. Well, the 1% is living. Is able to live out their differentiative desire and impose that on the rest of the 99%. And if we're just, associative, that could be very, very dystopian. If we all just were following and wanting to be part of a social whole, that could be actually fascism, is where you create a unity at the expense of diversity, where we just all kind of glom together around a common charismatic leader who's a dictator. We all submit our wills and we all form one to create this bigger whole based on our own submission of our own selves. So any of those principles taken by themselves are not very liberatory at all. But when you put them together, they can form potentially a dynamic gestalt where there's an interplay between them. There's a dialectical relationship between them as one kind of can fold out of the next, but there's also an interplay between those principles. So if you are an activist and you're creating a project, whether it's a study group or it's you're planning a street protest or whatever it is that you're doing, it's kind of a cool thing to try to go through those elements and see, to what extent is my project making a space that's sensual? Are we eating and making groovy food together? Are we creating art that's beautiful and pleasing? Are we creating ways to make you feel welcomed and inclusive and part of a social whole? It's associative. Are we creating opportunities for people to express themselves as individuals, learning how to speak and write within the movement, or just some people are musicians and they play really great music for people in the movement. Are we creating ways for people to grow and develop as we study and learn together? And are we really are we using our oppositional desire to create a better world? So it's kind of like a checklist, but those principles can potentially all kind of work together.
So that's part 1 of my conversation with Chaia Heller from the Institute for Social Ecology. Part 2 is the episode right after this one, so stay tuned. We'll talk about the importance of grounding a movement in rationality, putting theory into practice, and hopefully making revolutionary history. Solarpunk Now is written, hosted, and produced by me, Luca Dowell. The Solarpunk theme song is by Red Keener on SoundCloud. My guest today was Chaia Heller of the Institute for Social Ecology. You can learn more about the Institute at social-ecology.org and check out Chaia's book, The Ecology of Everyday Life, at the Anarchist Library, links in the description. You can follow my show on Twitter at SolarpunkCast or visit solarpunkcast.net for all episodes, including show notes. You can also visit solarpunkcast.net to donate to the show. I do all of this myself and I don't run any ads, so your support is greatly appreciated. That's solarpunkcast.net, link in the description. And remember, the realization of any vision requires action. I strongly encourage you to get involved with local organizations whose goals align with the brighter future you want to see. Analysis is important, but we have to back it up with practice. Keep dreaming big, and as always, keep up the good work.